Okay, picking up where I left off last time. Um, yeah, I was trying to think if there was a visual way to, verbal way to do the parallel cousin, cross cousin. Um, Easiest way I can think of it in most societies is parallel cousins would be the folks who generally have the same last name as you do. And this is, you have to remember when we're talking parallel cousins and cross cousins, we're talking about unilineal systems. In other words, you trace descent through either men, you trace descent through women. So in a patrilineal system, brothers would be seen as, having the same relationship. They keep the same last name. Their wives would take the names of their husbands when they move into the family. So the family would be defined by the male members. In a matrilineal system, the family would be defined by the female members. The guys would take the woman's name when they move in. Children from those brothers' kids would be parallel cousins because the kids would have the same last name because their dads both have the same last name if it's a patrilineal system. In a cross cousin system, it would be if the two guys have a sister. When she got married, she takes her husband's name. So even though she's their sister, upon marriage, she actually moves to another family. Her children would be considered cross cousins to the guy's children. So if you're trying to figure out, if you're looking at one of those lineage charts, this might be the fastest way to sort of verbalize it. And this is really the key thing, is in many societies, as long as the kids don't have the same last name, then they're considered potential marriageable kin. If they have the same last name in most societies, they're not potential kin in the sense of marriage possibilities. And you have to remember the other part of this when you're talking about marriage, we'll get into that just in a second, is that marriage is highly stressful for most societies. And it's certainly true in American society. We think of the stereotype of the in-laws. Marriage involves almost invariably bringing in people who you don't know much about. And you have to remember, especially in most societies, which traditionally, maybe not so much now, but traditionally had an attitude that once you married, you couldn't break it. Marriage was permanent. And despite the modern American stereotype, marriage is between families. Families intermarry. One family marries with another family, and that's the the bond that's then tied. So now you've got a whole chunk of in-laws, a whole set of people who are now relatives, who in many cases weren't relatives before. And while you might know a fair amount about the spouse, if it's your son that's getting married, you know a fair amount about his, bride-to-be. That doesn't mean you know a hell of a lot about the rest of the family that are now your relatives. This is one of the huge stressors in many societies is in-laws, especially if it's permanent, and especially if this involves economic and other types of permanent social relationships that you got yourself into that you have no way of getting out of. And this goes with the fact that in most societies, it sort of ties into what the last time I was talking about with clans, is that you have to remember that one of the huge fears in most societies is the word stranger. Who is a stranger radically varies from society to society, but there are no society that I can think of which have a positive view of strangers. Strangers are random, strangers are unpredictable, strangers you don't know about, just sort of by definition. And while on one hand, cultures are diverse and sort of dynamic, cultures also base a lot of what makes them attractive on their predictability. People want to know when they get up in the morning that the values and attitudes that they woke up to last week are still around this week and will still be around next week, because that's what they teach their kids. That's what they learned when they were kids. So people want stability and predictability in their lives. We'll see this when we get into religion, look at Durkheim stuff. In a kinship system, that's what kinship gives you. Kinship, on the one hand, means that to a certain extent, the relatives that you're born with, you have. So it's predictable. You might be stuck with them if you don't get along very well, but nonetheless, they're what you got. So there's a large predictable element that when you bring in marriage kin, you're bringing in strangers, and that brings an enormous amount of unpredictability. Now, there's potentially that might be good in the sense that you're going to benefit from it, but it might also be that you're going to end up with a disaster on your hands because you didn't check enough, or you didn't understand enough, or you didn't realize that so and so was going to be your kin, because it's not just the couple that's getting married; it's all the relatives they bring in with them. So marriage is incredibly stressful in most societies, and this is why there's a whole set of rituals attached to it that involve things like people that check that out. You have matchmakers whose job is to make sure that the two families are compatible before the marriage takes place. And this is one reason why in most societies there's a very low positive reaction to the idea of people getting married for love, where two individuals love each other and they get married. In fact, if you go back to Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the sort of the subtext of all that is, of course, that you've got two families that are in a blood feud. And it doesn't matter when the two individuals love each other. The families are literally, you know, at gunpoint or knife point against each other. And that's the context. And that actually is, it's important to remember in even in European traditions till less than 100 years ago, there would be very little sympathy for Romeo and Juliet. It would be like, well, how could you break, you know, your family's rules in terms of what you're supposed to do, especially with someone like that. So in most societies, marriage was something that people were afraid of, families especially, and so they went into it, you know, with a large amount of trepidation, basically. So in that context, if you have a group of people who you know, so for example, remember you got two brothers with kids over here and you got a sister with kids over here. If one of these guys' kids is looking for a marriage partner, her kids make a real logical choice, because even though she's married into another family, theoretically, since everyone still interacts, you know from her what her family's like. So there's much less surprises there. They're much less strangers than someone from, you know, 300 miles away. And the same applies to this family here. Yeah, she moved into the family, but they know through here, they know about your family, so they know who this kid is. So there's less surprise. So this is one of the main reasons why in many societies, cross-cousin marriage is actually highly valued, because what it did is it lowered the risk level, if you would, of unwelcome surprises when the marriage takes place. Because again, you have to remember, almost invariably in cross-cousin marriage, there's no such thing as divorce. Once you're married, you're there till death. And the families stay married. So in that context, they remain, you know, they remain relatives. Even if something happens to the original couple that were married, these are now in-laws. They're still in-laws. So cross-cousin marriage was incredibly attractive when you deathly are afraid of strangers, because this limits the amount of strangers or surprises that you're bringing into your family in a permanent basis. In this context, it's important to remember that this also ties in that I mentioned, I think last time, is this idea of incest. You have to remember that all societies have an incest rule, but there's several things that sort of, you know, have to be remembered when you talk about that. Just because you have incest in most societies does not mean it's the same people in most societies. Incest at its minimal level is usually the nuclear family, parents and their children and then siblings. But it gets really complex once you move out of that sort of minimal pool. And then, you know, within the minimal pool, there's a fair amount of logic for incest rules, because that's when you start to get into issues of, you know, of genetic inbreeding and stuff like that in these very, very small populations, if it's just people and their immediate relatives. And there's a fair amount of documentary evidence for this, but on the other hand, a lot of it is pretty selectively designed to scare the bejesus out of folks so they will never think of incest relationships. And in most societies, it's punished. In many societies, death is the punishment. So incest rules, or incest taboos as they're sometimes called, are pretty much universal in human societies, but who that's going to include, in other words, who's on that list of an incest relationship, varies tremendously. In fact, in the United States, it varies from state to state. In some states, it includes first cousins. In some states, it includes second cousins. And, you know, for a lot of mainland Americans, they wouldn't even know who their second cousins are. So you can find yourself illegally married to someone who even your family doesn't consider a relative, you know, because they forgot over time that lineage has now branched off and people don't remember anymore. So incest taboos, even in American society, are really sort of odd because there's no standard to them. From one spot in the United States to another spot, they're totally different. And like I mentioned, if you're on a reservation, which is in the United States, the rules of incest are in many ways almost entirely illegal, or at least what's not incest in those reservations is almost blatantly incest off a lot of the reservations, because the vast majority of Native Americans have cross-cousin marriage as a viable marriage option, which means you better stay on the reservation or else just not tell anyone you're married when you leave. You know, so incest taboo is very complex for one reason. That's one reason. The second reason has to do with intentionally breaking the taboo, or not bending, it's actually breaking it. This is frequently done within particular societies when you have some group in the society that's trying to argue that it's actually different, in the sense that they're somehow special related to the gods, or special in the sense that they're more powerful than everyone else, or maybe they're even gods themselves. So if you look at one of the most famous of these would be ancient Egypt, Ptolemaic Egypt. What you find during the Pharaonic period, well, actually more the Pharaonic than Ptolemaic period, but if you look at the ancient Egypt, say the pyramids, pyramid period, what you find is traditionally in that system, cousins would marry. Now, Egyptian society in that same period had that as an incest rule. So the general population was not allowed to marry cousins. Only the members of the ruling elite could. And this was one way that they reinforced the fact that they were not normal people, that because they were special, had a special relationship with the gods and a special relationship with everything, that meant that they didn't have to follow rules that human beings followed, which would be all the rest of the Egyptians. This is actually very similar to what you find here in Hawaii with like Pio marriage, where the Hayate here would intermarry with cousins, and in some cases half brother, half sister, even brother and sister, Pio marriage. And again, if you went outside the high chiefs of the Iki, you'd find that with the Maka and Anar, the rest of the Hawaiian population, that was punishable by death. So on one hand, Hawaiian society was very clear that for the majority population, this was incest and you cannot do it or you get killed. For the very, very high elites, it was a selected and attractive form of marriage for a whole mess of ritualized reasons. But one of the main reasons, very simply, was saying that as part of the chiefs, you were a different type of thing than people who were commoners. And so the rules that commoners had to follow were rules that you actually could not only break, but rules that in some cases you were supposed to break. And that's, again, the same type of logic. Probably the most famous of all of these would be the Hohenzollerns and the ruling families of Europe, where cousin marriage was incredibly common. During World War I, the Kaiser of Germany is the nephew of the Queen of England, or I think she just passed away, Queen Victoria, one Queen Victoria's nephews. I think four of the different ruling monarchs in Europe at the time were actually first cousins. And at least two of them were actually cousins by virtue of cousin marriage in the family. And this is oftentimes used in part as an example of incest inbreeding with the hemophilia and the sort of mental problems that the Hohenzollerns, ruling families of a lot of Europe, had because of this highly persistent inbreeding pattern going over hundreds of years. But it was also important to remember that to this population, they were trying to prove that they were special of God, that they were not part of the normal population. So therefore, they didn't have to follow rules that everyone else had to follow. And to a certain extent, being the child of a brother-sister marriage made you a walking, talking example of your special relationship with the divine because you were the child of that relationship. And commoners couldn't have that and couldn't be someone like you. So what you find is all societies have an incest regulation. And it varies tremendously in terms of who's in it outside of the nuclear family. But in a fairly large number of societies, you find that for highly specialized elites, usually tied to some sort of ritual, divine logic, they actually put themselves in a situation where they very calculated, very visibly break that incest regulation for the purpose of amplifying their special status, and actually use the children of that relationship and those marriages to reflect their unique relationship, both with, whatever's in charge, the divine, and also with the rest of the population, the poor, peasants, commoners, et cetera, who can't do this stuff. So incest is sort of interesting because on one hand, it seems like a technical thing. Oh, you're talking about massive inbreeding. But, if you know anything about genetic populations, as long as you don't have a real persistent pattern of very small populations, you're not really looking at an enormous amount of risk over a fairly short period of time. You'd have to do inbreeding over a number of generations. The main reason for it is sort of a way for societies to reinforce their, the idea of rules and regulations, and of course, in many cases, to force families to seek marriage partners outside the immediate family group, which is necessary if you're going to move resources and people and everything around the planet. And the other part is just sort of political complexities of manipulation of incest, which is really common, for example, here in the Pacific, and also in many societies where incest was, in a very visible, calculated way, broken to prove that you're not part of the norm. Okay, so this sort of starts segue into marriage anyways. So I already mentioned this, but just to reiterate, despite the modern American stereotype, which is marriage is between individuals, marriage isn't between individuals, marriage is between families. Now, the size of the family group involved in the process varies. But even in American society, if you look at the studies they do of divorce, you find that usually the one or two, in fact, top reason for divorce is oftentimes defined as incompatibility. But the main part of that incompatibility is incompatibility with the in-laws. In other words, it's even though a couple might get married thinking that they're two individuals getting married, almost invariably people bring family into the equation. And especially, I would think in many ways, if you haven't thought about that in advance, then if you bring family into the equation as an afterthought after the marriage has taken place, it's not a huge surprise that things are going to blow up. So the idea is, it's important to remember that even in societies which make a huge amount of noise about marriage being an individual decision between two individuals, the reality is marriage is invariably a larger collective event. And most societies are very, very clear and straight up on that, and just sort of make it very clear that that's the way it works. It's only a few societies like American society where individualism is so highly valued that there's sort of this fiction that somehow that marriage is an individual phenomenon. In most societies, if families are getting involved and families agree to a marriage, this also means there's a fair amount of pressure from the families for a marriage to persist, even if the individuals who are getting married don't necessarily get along particularly well. Because now the families are now tied into a net of in-laws. There's a net of relationships there. And it's probably in some way, shape, or form to an advantage to both families to have that relationship. So therefore, they're going to be really upset if the individuals that started the whole process suddenly break apart. So it's important to remember that marriage involves kin. And also kinship is probably one of the major reasons why marriages stay together versus sort of like emotional, personal bonds between two individuals. In most societies, marriage is very contractual. In a large number of societies, this is even true in a lot of European societies, there's not the idea of the romantic love component or attraction for the other person to be really front and first place. Other things are oftentimes considered equally, if not more valuable. Social status, the obligation to family, the need to have kids, any sorts of other type of things, which make it look, and at least to Americans, given the American stereotype, makes it look like a business decision. And that's really accurate, because in most societies, marriage is sort of a business decision. Because you want this to go for the long run, you want family to be involved, you want family to support it, and so you make sure that there's a bunch of reasons why this is a good idea, which will carry the couple together through periods when they're maybe not so happy with each other on an individual basis. The contractual part of the relationship will keep the family as a unit together. So most societies, again, are very upfront about this and see marriage as being a contractual relationship. That's certainly very true in most of Asia. In most of Asia, people are very leery about couples getting married because they love each other. They want to know, what's the practical aspects of this? What are you going to get out of this? Is he a good match or she is a good choice? What are their families like? All this plays into the evaluation of the decision process. Now, it's interesting in American society because of this whole fascination with sort of this esoteric concept of emotional love, is that if people get married for practical reasons, he's a doctor, so for example, he'd be a good choice because that means we're going to have a successful family and be making money. There's oftentimes a whole mess of negative stereotypes attached to that in terms of someone marrying someone else because of the practical value of it. So it's sort of interesting in American society, oftentimes disses on people pretty brutally if they get married for what in much of the rest of the world would be the reasons you get married. Which is one reason why in a lot of other societies, I think Americans are sort of mental when it comes to things like marriage. It's also one of the reasons why it doesn't surprise many people in a lot of societies that Americans have an incredibly high divorce rate. Because they just look at the reasons that Americans are getting married and they're like, well, why do you think that's going to last 5, 10, 20 years? So if we look at patterns of marriage, there's actually not very many. And it's just sort of a note on all this. It's important to remember when you look at kinship, you can find, I took whole courses in kinship. And I don't remember anything in it much, but I guess this stuff. But kinship in anthropology has been an enormously powerful and central force in anthropology. In large part because you have to remember, anthropology traditionally was someone going to a different group. So if you're an anthropologist and you're suddenly going to go work with, say, the Hopi on the reservation, one of the reservations in the Southwest, and you don't speak the language and they don't know who the hell you are. One of the easy ways to talk about people, learn their language, learn their attitudes and stuff like that, is to ask them, who are your relatives? Why are these people your relatives? How are they related to you? It's a real good way to sort of break the ice if you're an anthropologist trying to figure out what makes another group tick. And so not surprisingly from the get-go, kinship in all its various forms, especially marriage and marriage rituals, were a big part of anthropology because it was a real efficient and highly effective way to learn about another group without stepping on people's toes, insulting them, or otherwise getting in their way. And they were generally questions that people would, in most cases, be really happy to answer because it was something that they felt comfortable talking about. They understood what they were talking about, and they could explain it. So kinship has been central in anthropology. One, because it's a central part of the anthropological experience for many anthropologists. Secondly, is because in most societies, your kin and the relationships that people have, including birth kin and also marriage kin, are central to things like land, certainly here in Hawaii. Land control, ownership, access to property and goods, everything is tied to kinship. So if you're trying to figure out who has access to a piece of property, guess what? You're going to be asking people about their relatives. So kinship is not only central to the human experience, but also anthropologists have and still do spend enormous amounts of time studying kinship because it's a really quick way to find out values in a group and what makes a group tick. And to a certain extent, given what I was just talking about American society and the value of individualism and its relationship to marriage, that's a perfect example of that. One of the best examples probably that exist in the American value of individualism is the idea that marriage should be between two individuals, despite all the evidence to the contrary. The fact that that persists, I mean, gets sort of amplified and constantly played up in all sorts of media is a really fascinating example of that sort of logic playing out. If you want to ever see this in Second Life, again, since you've looked at that already, it's a fascinating example of stuff in Second Life. If you actually look at Second Life marriages, the number of marriages that are done in Second Life that, for I guess sort of marriages in the sense that the people are getting married in Second Life see themselves married in this life. In fact, if you think about it, your Pleasantville population consisted of a bunch of married kin in many cases. So marriage and kinship are not only central to anthropology, but they're central to the way we see ourselves as groups. Okay, so back to the marriage stuff. So what you find is there's very few sort of varieties of how marriage happens. One of the really key parts that's of huge interest to anthropologists because it says a lot about a group is what we call exogamy and endogamy. So if you think of exo as being outside and endo as being inside, exogamy, if you go to a particular culture and you ask them, what is the group that you cannot marry? That's your exogamous group. Now, in American society, you'd sort of get two answers to this. One would be sort of obviously would be your incest group. But the other one in American society, depending on what your group you're looking at, especially Anglo-American society, would be people, for example, of lower socioeconomic status. So for example, since you guys are going to be college graduates, traditionally in Anglo-American society, if you're a college graduate, you shouldn't marry someone who doesn't have a high school diploma. So that would be an exogamous group because the family would say, how could you marry them? They never even got a high school degree. And the family would be really dissing on you if you thought that was a good idea. So exogamous groups can be formal incest groups, which are real straightforward. But exogamous groups can also reflect, social, regional, and other type of values and attitudes that you see in a society. So again, it makes a really handy way if you're an anthropologist to find out how the group divides itself up when you ask people rather innocently, oh, your son looks like he's about the age to get married. Who would it be a bad idea for him to bring home and introduce to you? Oftentimes people just go off and tell you all sorts of good stuff. Now, the endogamous group is the flip side of that. And again, American society is really interested in this. So American society doesn't want you to marry down socioeconomically. The endogamous group is the group that people would like you to marry. So this would be the group that your parents would like you to bring home as a potential spouse, your relatives would like you to bring home as a potential spouse. Now, in American society, this is generally up the socioeconomic ladder. So on one hand, Americans don't want to marry down. But what you find is in American society, most folks, if they could, will want to marry up. Now, of course, if you think about that, if one person's married up, the other person's married down. So you can see where exogamy and endogamy can get really be a furball pretty quick. So the end result of all these is what you find is in many societies, who you marry is actually a much smaller package than all the available folks in that age group that aren't, related to you directly. There's a lot of very complex patterns in terms of exogamy and endogamy. If you go back to clan systems, exogamy in many cases is folks in the same clan. Endogamy is oftentimes a particular clan that traditionally your clan marries in with. So clan forms, again, get involved in all this stuff too. So from one group to the other, exogamous patterns and endogamous patterns are a really valuable way to look at how the group structures itself, even if they don't necessarily want to talk about it. Americans like to pretend that there's no such thing as class socioeconomic differentiation in American society. Well, everyone has a chance to get ahead. But if you look at exogamy rules in American society, they're pretty rigid, and there's not that much movement between them. Okay. Monogamy, polygamy, this is just when you marry, how many people do you marry? The traditional form in most societies sort of varied between monogamy, which is marrying a single spouse, we have one spouse, or polygyny, which is men having more than one wife. These were the two most common. The other form that was less common was polyandry, which is women having more than one husband. This is actually fairly common in a lot of the Pacific, but it wasn't found in too many areas outside of the Pacific that I'm aware of. There might be, I'm sure there's some. So monogamy is probably the most straightforward until you get into the modern situation, again, especially American society. So monogamy meant that a couple marries. Okay, so now I got a single spouse. This is found in a lot of societies today, but in a lot of these societies, this wasn't the case till recently, as we'll see later. If you look at Asian societies, specifically Japanese and Chinese society, I'm most familiar with Japan and Hong Kong and China, what you find is monogamous relationships were not the only relationship. In both Chinese and Japanese societies, you can only have one wife. But traditionally, if you were wealthy, both men and women would have more than one concubine. And there's not really an English word for a Chinese word for concubine, but there were male concubines for wealthy women. And so what you would have is they'd technically be a monogamous relationship. You only have one spouse. But what that meant is that actually it wasn't necessarily sexual relationships, and it wasn't necessarily kids, which gets much more complicated. Now, in American society, we made it complicated yet another way. In American society, the average marriage statistically lasts for around 5 years. Now, what that means in a person's lifetime, they could go through, several relationships. And what you find in the United States is what is the legal form is what we call serial monogamy. So you can only have one spouse, but it's one spouse at a time. But then the spouses break up and get remarried. And this is why you end up with that fascinating concept that American society talks about a lot, especially in education, which is the blended family, where you have individuals who have been married, they've had children from the first marriage, and this guy's got children from his first marriage, and now these families have now married again, and now they're both bringing in children from other families. So if you visualize for a second the complexity we had before when we're talking about bringing in a spouse for another family, you can imagine the zoo that you get into when you're bringing kids who have other families who are not part of the family that's being brought directly into the marriage. So to a certain extent, if both of these spouses had kids from prior marriages, you've actually got 4 families sort of getting married. There's the family here and the family here that the spouses are reflecting. But there's also the children that, of course, half of that was another family and half of this was another family. It's a zoo. And so this is serial monogamy. Americans are way ahead of the game in terms of everyone else in doing this. It causes enormous amount of social problems because American society traditionally, till 100 years ago, was a monogamous society where you had one spouse till it keeled over. So you didn't have to deal with kids from another marriage because that wasn't an acceptable form of marriage. If you had kids, you just stayed a widow or a widower, and the kids you never remarried. So the idea that you actually have multiple spouses over your lifetime, and that means your kids have multiple stepdads or stepmoms or whatever it is really a 20th, 21st century thing in American society. And it causes an enormous amount of social dislocation and emotional trauma because you have to remember the society socially and in values has never really accepted that. So American society still likes to pretend it's a monogamous society. So there aren't the social mechanisms and family expectations, et cetera, that you would have if serial monogamy were actually seen as socially acceptable to the level it's practiced. So what you have is you end up with a situation where especially the kids are in families, but the society doesn't really know how to deal with kids who aren't part of that particular family. And so people have to wing it. and families have to figure it out on their own. The society tends to be very uncomfortable about it because it still likes to pretend that monogamy is the norm when the society has changed, but the society's values haven't changed with those changes. So it's an enormous stress factor in American society and other places where this is starting to happen more and more. Polygyny in most societies is oftentimes a fantasy. You know, the Americans have stereotypes, for example, places like Saudis and Saudi Arabians and stuff where you have multiple wives. It's important to remember that polygyny is still family versus family marriage. And the key part about this is the fact that in societies where you find polygyny, what you find is if a guy wants to have multiple wives, polygyny, for example, was the norm in Polynesia and Melanesia. Micronesia, to be honest, I'm not too sure. No, actually, part of Micronesia was polyandry, rather rare, which is more uncommon. But if you're a guy and you want to have more than one wife, in most of these societies where you have this as an option, you had to show that you had the economic power. In other words, you had the ability to actually care for a second wife. And secondly, the family actually supported this happening. So again, this isn't something individuals do, it's something that families do. And you have to remember, this goes back to a very practical aspect. Women are the major producers of resources in most societies, especially in agricultural societies. So if you're a society where people grow stuff, women do most of the work. The women do the majority of labor. So in that situation, if you're a guy and you want to be more successful, the obvious way to do it is like a merger. You basically want more than one wife because that adds another labor source to your, potential resource base that you've got. And this is how you see it played out in most societies, is polygyny is a reflection of power and resources. The more power, the more resources, the more wives that you have, the more wives that you have, the more power and resources you have. In modern societies, like say in Saudi society, you actually find that the number of wives is a reflection of your social status. So given your rank in Saudi society, specifies the number of women that you can have as your wives. So it's based in part on resources, but it's based more importantly on your connections and vis-a-vis the royal family. So again, it's not a personal thing. It's totally a family thing. It's totally a group thing. Polyandry is actually quite rare. It's very rare for women to have multiple husbands. It was found in some areas of Western Micronesia, but I don't remember exactly what the context was. And in fact, most of those places changed radically after Spanish or American control. So they're generally not found anymore. But at least the early German accounts and stuff, where the Germans controlled most of this region in the 19th century, German accounts talk about polyandry in the Western region a fair amount. And of course, they tried to stomp it out because as far as they were concerned, from their standpoint, which was monogamy was the only way, they weren't going to let the Micronesians, women have multiple husbands. It was just unacceptable, the German colonial system. So polyandry is fairly rare, but again, if you look at it, it would be the same thing. The men have particular access to particular type of resources. Women that have power and status want more, and so in marrying multiple husbands, they gain access to more of these power and resources. More power and resources mean more husbands. So polyandry and polygyny both have the same logic. So polygamy, which is the general term that's used, in fact, in the United States, they usually talk about polygamy when they're actually talking about polygyny. So polygamy is just the various forms of multiple marriage, but almost invariably, it's always group driven. And secondly, it's almost invariably tied to access to resources and power. And of course, all that, status also. Last of these is sort of this idea of bride price and dowry, since that's sort of a good place to finish. When you're looking at bride price and dowry, bride price has one of the weirdest stereotypes. And again, I think this is because it's not acceptable in most modern societies. Bride price is not that you buy a bride. In fact, it's usually called bride wealth here in the Pacific because that's more accurate. What you do is when a couple's getting married, especially if the woman's going to move to the man's family, she's going to be leaving her family of birth, which means, again, as I mentioned before, if women provide most of the labor, so if women do most of the work, then if a woman's leaving this family, she's going to move into this family, it means that they're going to lose her labor because now this family's going to take over her labor. So on that point, this family wants to be compensated for the fact that she's leaving. So it's sort of like moving from one company to another company. You're going to be working for these guys now. So in that situation, this family has to compensate this family for the loss of the lady. And that's what bride wealth is, or bride price. Bride price is what the groom's family pays to the bride's family for them to accept the marriage. Now, given the fact, again, this is permanent, you have to remember, the last thing you want to have is them buy her Because you can imagine if this family pays this family a group set of money to buy a lady in this family, she comes over here, she's probably not going to be a happy camper, both with the family she's married into. She's probably going to be really pissed at the family that sold her. So she's going to be like a bomb ready to go off, which is the worst possible situation. You've got to live with her for the rest of your combined lives. So bride price in the sense of buying women very rarely happened. Bride price in terms of compensating a family for the loss of a woman was typical in most societies till relatively recently. Now, one of the weirder versions of this would be the flip. And this has to do with really, really intensively patrilineal systems, which you find, these are usually religiously driven. So parts of Western Europe are probably the strongest in this. And you see it traditionally in a lot of Anglo-American society. And this is the dowry. So I'll let you guys think about it just for a second. I'll give you like 5 seconds to try to figure out if you remember what a dowry actually is. Like a juice. Okay. A dowry was oftentimes called in the United States, and I think this is from the British, called a hope chest. So in a dowry system, what happens is, and now you have to remember the weird thing is dowry happens when a woman moves into a husband's family. So it's still patrilineal. So weird thing is both dowry and bride price involve women moving to men's families. So they're based off the same scenario. But in societies, which for various reasons, usually religious, had an attitude that women were less than men, that women were devalued. Never mind the fact they're still providing most of the labor, that doesn't change. So none of the practicalities are actually in place here. We're talking about religion and belief. In societies where women are seen as having little value, then when a woman marries, her family is supposed to pay to get rid of her. So a dowry is the bride's family paying the groom's family to take her. And like I said, traditionally, this was in Euro-American society. This was called, among other things, this was called a hope chest. The woman was expected to bring a large wooden box that had linen in it, that had cooking stuff in it, that had everything that a wife would bring to her new family, so that she could just, start running in terms of, cooking dinner and washing clothes and doing all the other stuff that women were supposed to do. There are very few societies where dowry was actually practiced. And that's generally because it just doesn't make any sense from an economic thing. It's based on an entire fiction. If women are providing most of the labor, why would the family want to lose her? So dowry was based on a very strong set of religious logics, which basically hypervalued men and totally devalued women. And so dowries were found Western Europe in some areas, into Anglo-American society in the United States. The other big place would be China. Now, in its most extreme form, and China was an example of this until the 1930s, for example, was that since in Chinese society, women had to be given away to men, and it cost the family a birth to give the woman away. It was very common in Chinese society, again, right into the 30s, in fact, right into the 50s, as far as I know, for female infanticide. So if you have small children who are girls, you don't necessarily kill them, but what you do is you don't feed them enough. You don't give them enough warm clothes in the winter. So if they die, it's sort of like you shed a few tears. But oh, good, that just saved the family a lot of money, because if she grew up, we would have had to pay to get rid of her. So female infanticide is very common in societies which have dowry, because families that have, in fact, in Chinese society till relatively recently, if you had a kid and the kid turned out to be a girl, you'd get a congratulation card, but it was actually a commiseration card. And it might say something like, oh, too bad you had a daughter. Maybe next time you get lucky and have a son. Or actually, in some cases, if it's more brutal, it would just say, oh, too bad you had a girl. So what this was, it was devaluing women. And ironically, in Chinese society, women do most of the labor. So go figure. So dowry is a real interesting thing. Bride price makes a fair amount of practical sense. Dowry is a illusion defined by societies which hypervalue men and hyper devalue women. Okay. It's a good place to stop on that rather grim topic, I guess.